Okay.
Hi, I'm Dennis Howard from the Movement for a Better America, and this is a story about a hero. He was my brother, but he could just as easily have been yours. It is the story of the last few months of a life that seemed very ordinary in most respects, but in fact turned out to be quite heroic, as would any life that followed in the footsteps of our Lord as he walked his last steps up the hill to Calvary. I was the last one of my family to see Eddie as he traveled across the country on a troop train headed for Korea. It was February 1951, and I was in Kansas City starting my career as a Catholic journalist on a daily called the Sun Herald. I was awakened at 1 a.m. by a telegram from Eddie. He was coming through St. Louis on a troop train. He said it would arrive in Kansas City at 1:30 a.m. and asked me to meet it. I hadn't seen him in a year, so I jumped at the chance. I must say it took some doing to talk the station master into letting me down to meet a troop train in the middle of a war. At first he said, "No way. You're not even supposed to know that troop train is here. Your brother could be court-martialed if they knew he sent you that telegram." My heart dropped as he walked away. Then just as suddenly he turned and said, "Well, I know how you feel. I have a son in the Air Force. The train is on track 7. But don't dare tell anyone I said so." When I got down to track 7, the train was already in, but it was blacked out, not a light in sight. I walked along until I came to an open door and poked my head in. There was Eddie, getting ready to cook breakfast for the Army. He greeted me warmly and enlisted me to start breaking hundreds of eggs into huge pots, while he put even bigger pans of bacon on the stove to cook. Soon the door at the end of the car opened, and in came Eddie's sidekick, still rubbing his eyes from sleep. He was a young guy who had lied about his age at 17 so he could join the Army. Eddie was 23. He looked at the big vat of eggs I had broken and told Eddie, "Did you forget? Today was the one day in the whole trip they were supposed to get their eggs cooked to order." In our enthusiasm, we had goofed. By the time everyone woke up, poor Eddie would have some explaining to do. But there was no way to unscramble all those eggs. At one point, Eddie and I swapped jackets and caps. He put on my overcoat and my hat, while I put on his Eisenhower jacket and his Army cap. Suddenly we realized how much alike we looked. We could easily trade places, and the Army would never know the difference. I felt that I would gladly trade places with him right then and there, but then I realized that Eddie was going in my place, not the other way around. We reminisced about all the experiences we shared growing up, but time passed quickly, and we soon heard the clang of the cars as the engine hooked up, telling us it was time for me to leave. Meanwhile, a fog had descended over the whole station. As I stood there waving, the train slowly moved away as Eddie and his buddy disappeared into the fog with each chug of the engine. That was the last time I was to see him and his young buddy. The vision of the two of them disappearing into the fog is with me yet. We exchanged letters at least once a week as the months wore on. Meanwhile, I followed the news of the war in my job at the paper, with each day's dispatches from Korea. Then his letters abruptly stopped, and soon the last few I sent were returned with the news that Eddie was missing in action. The last one he received from me was a letter quoting Psalm 91. 1,000 shall fall at thy side, and 10,000 at thy right hand, and no harm shall come thee, for he shall give his angels charge over thee, to keep thee in all thy ways. That certainly gave me hope that he might survive his capture. Strangely, he went missing on the same day that my adventure in Catholic daily journalism ended. The Sun Herald closed on April 28, 1951. That remains, for me, a day to remember. All we were told was that the hill he was on was overrun by the Chinese and retaken by the Americans the next day. There was no sign of Eddie. Unfortunately, that was all the news we got of Eddie for the next 59 years. We sat through the prisoner exchanges, hoping and praying that his name would be on the list of returning POWs. We listened through 2 long lists, but still no Eddie. We tried repeatedly to get more information from the Army, but all we ever got was a bureaucratic runaround about a warehouse fire in St. Louis, in which all records were supposedly lost. My mother died in 1994 at age 93, still hoping and praying that someday Eddie would return. She bought a stained glass window and a pew in our parish church in Queens in his memory, and I will never forget how the light fell across the church at her funeral mass. It came right down through Eddie's window and across his pew and lit her coffin as she lay there. I took it as a sign that they were together at last. I thought that was the end of Eddie's story until a few weeks ago when my son Thomas found a Korean War website where you could search for information about missing POWs. There we found the barest information about Eddie. Then came more news about the remains of the missing that had been returned and the possibility that he might be among them. I sent DNA samples to a forensic lab in Hawaii, but it will take a year or more to find out if his remains were returned. Some are still being held in North Korea. However, we did learn many details about what happened to Eddie after his capture. They are based on information provided by other returning POWs who survived the same journey he took. They are also a reminder that when Jesus asks us to follow him, that can sometimes mean walking all the way up the hill with him to Calvary. In the 2 months after his capture, Eddie went through a painful ordeal, slowly being moved northward in a series of marches reminiscent of the famous Bataan Death March from World War II. The only thing they were given to eat was a thin gruel made of rice and millet. Their only choice was to eat it or die. They had no fresh water to drink or to bathe. The only water came from mud puddles left along the road by the occasional rain. Nearly all of them suffered from malnutrition and dysentery, and many died along the way. That was how Eddie died on July 8, 1951, somewhere near the Yalu River that forms the border between North Korea and China. Local villages reportedly buried him by the side of the road. I still pray for his young buddy whom I met that night on the troop training in Kansas City. I don't remember his name, so I have no way of finding out what happened to him. But they both taught me something about what it means to be a hero. It doesn't require some grand heroic act that will write your name in the history books. It takes simple acts of daily courage to accept the things that God sends us as challenges every single day. Do we greet them with honor and fortitude and faithfulness to what God calls on us to do? Or do we complain about every little setback and disappointment, questioning what God expects of us amid the difficulties of life? How often do we say, "Why me, Lord?" Or how often do we rise to each occasion by doing the very best we can? And how willing are we to risk life, honor, and sacred fortune to defend the values on which our nation was founded? My brother was a hero for one reason. He walked faithfully in the footsteps of our Lord, our supreme hero who gave his life for us on the cross so that all of us might share in his glory. Eddie taught me a lot of things as we grew up, but that was certainly the most important lesson of all. He gave his life so that you and I and our children and grandchildren can still breathe free. Thank you.